At 4:12, the nursery corridor door was ajar by 3 inches. It should have been sealed. I stopped before crossing the threshold and noticed a stuffed lion placed upright against protocol. The night camera indicator was dark. I checked the log. No entry. My hand stayed on the radio, but I did not call it in. Something in the silence suggested the problem was already inside. The corridor outside the nursery was maintained at a constant 19 degrees. Edward noticed the cold immediately, the way it pressed against his knuckles through the gloves. Temperature deviations were rare in this wing, logged automatically and reviewed at the end of every shift. He paused just short of the threshold, eyes fixed on the narrow line of darkness where the door stood open. 3 inches. Enough to be deliberate, not enough to be careless. He did not enter yet. The corridor lighting was dimmed for night protocol, recessed panels casting a soft amber wash along the walls. No shadows should have moved here. Nothing should have been out of place, and yet the stuffed lion sat upright against the baseboard, its stitched eyes facing the door. Toys were permitted only inside the nursery and only during waking hours. The evening checklist required them to be cleared and logged by the attendant nurse. Edward shifted his weight slightly, boots silent on the polished stone. He scanned the ceiling corner where the night camera should have displayed its small green indicator. It was dark. That alone warranted an alert. Combined with the door, the toy, and the temperature, it formed a pattern that his training insisted he acknowledge. He reached to his wrist console and brought up the corridor log. The last entry showed a routine sweep at 1:30. No irregularities, no follow-up notes. The system timestamp pulsed steadily, indifferent. Edward knew the layout well enough to visualize the rest of the wing without looking. 2 guards posted at the far junction, 1 rotating patrol due in 11 minutes, no reported movement. Protocol required immediate escalation for a compromised camera. Protocol also required confirmation before triggering a response that would wake the household. Edward stood still, listening. The corridor carried sound cleanly at night. He heard nothing but the low hum of climate control and, faintly, the ticking of a distant clock. He keyed a silent mark into his personal log, noting time and visual anomalies. Personal logs were unofficial but tolerated, provided they were factual and restrained. He avoided adjectives. He avoided conclusions. With 2 fingers, he nudged the door inward. It opened without resistance, the hinge moving smoothly. That, too, was wrong. Nursery doors were pressure-balanced to resist drafts. Inside, the room was lit by a single wall lamp set to its lowest setting. The curtains were drawn. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sweeter, like soap. Edward did not cross the threshold. He scanned left to right, cataloging. The night nurse's chair was empty. The monitoring tablet sat on the side table, screen dark. The child's bed was visible, its outline still beneath the covers. He withdrew his hand and closed the door carefully, returning it to its proper seal. The latch engaged with a soft click. The corridor felt colder immediately, as if reacting. Edward exhaled slowly. The irregularities were minor when taken alone. Together, they suggested intention. He updated his log again, this time flagging the entry for later correlation. He did not notify Central Command. Not yet. He picked up the stuffed lion, noting its weight and condition. Clean, recently handled. He placed it back against the wall exactly where it had been. Evidence, he reminded himself, was not only physical, sometimes it was procedural. At the end of the corridor, a light shifted as one of the posted guards adjusted position. Edward raised his hand slightly, a signal to hold. He wanted the scene undisturbed. He stood there for another full minute, letting the silence settle. The longer he remained, the more certain he became that the breach had already occurred, and that whatever it was, it had been quiet. Edward moved down the corridor methodically, checking each access panel and service alcove. All were sealed. All showed normal readings. The anomaly was contained to the nursery threshold. That narrowed the scope and complicated the implications. Restricted access meant restricted responsibility. He stopped at the camera junction box recessed into the wall opposite the nursery. The panel seal was intact, no signs of tampering. He opened it with his clearance key and checked the internal status lights. The camera had power. The feed was disabled manually. That required a secondary authorization, one above nursing staff, but below senior security. Edward closed the panel and recorded the detail. His jaw tightened slightly, a physical response he did not consciously register. He had served long enough to know that system gaps were rarely accidental and never isolated. He approached the junction guard, a younger man on his second month in the palace rotation. Edward asked quietly if he had observed any movement in the last hour. The guard shook his head. No deliveries, no staff calls, no alerts. Edward nodded and dismissed him back to position. Returning to the nursery door, Edward rested his palm briefly against the wood. The grain was smooth, recently polished. Inside, the child remained unseen, unheard. Edward considered the options available to him. Immediate escalation would trigger an internal review and likely result in a swift explanation, tidy and procedural. Quiet continuation would allow him to observe, to confirm patterns before they were corrected. He chose the latter, not out of defiance, but out of caution. Edward adjusted the corridor log, adding a maintenance check request for the camera feed, flagged as non-urgent. It would be routed through technical services at shift change. He scheduled a secondary patrol pass through the wing under the guise of routine variation, nothing that would raise attention. As he stepped back, he noticed a faint mark on the floor near the doorframe, a smudge, easily missed. He crouched and examined it under the low light. A partial footprint, soft-soled, not a guard's issue boot, likely a slipper, household staff or family. He photographed it with his wrist console and tagged it privately. The clock at the end of the corridor chimed once, 04:18. Edward straightened and resumed his post, positioning himself where he could observe both the nursery door and the camera indicator without appearing to do so. His posture remained relaxed, unremarkable. Anyone passing would see only a guard at rest. Inside his mind, however, the sequence was already forming. Door, toy, camera, log, footprint. Each element connected by access and timing. The picture was incomplete, but it was no longer empty. He did not yet know whose authority had crossed the threshold or why the system had been silenced instead of bypassed. He only knew that the nursery, the most controlled space in the palace, had been altered without record. And in Edward's experience, the absence of a record was never neutral. Edward waited 6 minutes before re-entering the nursery corridor. Enough time to ensure no one was watching patterns. Enough time for the space to settle back into stillness. The posted guards remained in position, unaware that anything had shifted. That was intentional. He approached the door again, this time without hesitation, and keyed his clearance. The seal disengaged softly. Inside, the room was unchanged in layout, but altered in atmosphere. The lamp still glowed at its lowest setting, yet the air felt heavier, warmer than the corridor, as if the climate control had lagged behind protocol. Prince James was not asleep. Edward saw the child's eyes first, open and fixed on the ceiling, too alert for the hour, too still. The blankets were pulled tight to the chest, hands hidden beneath them. No movement except the shallow rise and fall of breathing. Edward did not speak. He closed the door behind him and stood where he was, allowing his presence to register naturally. Guards were familiar to the child, part of the environment, meant to be reassuring without intrusion. James turned his head slightly. His gaze moved to Edward's shoulder, not his face. That detail mattered. Children who felt safe tended to look directly. Avoidance suggested either fear or conditioning. Edward crossed the room slowly, each step measured. He noted the nurse's chair again, empty. The monitoring tablet remained dark. It should have been active, displaying vitals and sleep data. He resisted the urge to turn it on immediately. "How long have you been awake?" Edward asked quietly. His voice was neutral, even, as if asking about the weather. James did not answer at first. His fingers tightened under the blanket. Edward waited. Silence was often more effective than reassurance. "I don't know," the child said finally. His voice was thin but steady. No crying. That absence was more concerning than tears. Edward nodded once, as if the response were sufficient. He pulled the chair back and sat, angling himself so he was visible but not looming. From this distance he could see faint redness around James's eyes, not fresh, not from a single incident. Edward asked no further questions yet. He scanned the room again, this time closer. A glass of water on the side table, half full. A folded handkerchief beside it, damp, recently used. "Did someone come in?" Edward asked. James hesitated. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to the ceiling. "I wasn't supposed to say," he replied. Edward felt the weight of that sentence settle. Children did not invent secrecy in safe environments. They learned it. "All right," Edward said simply. He did not challenge the boundary. Instead, he adjusted the blanket slightly, a practical gesture. "You're not in trouble." James's breathing changed, a small release. Edward reached for the monitoring tablet and powered it on. The screen flickered, then displayed standard readings. Heart rate elevated above resting baseline, sleep cycle fragmented. The data showed multiple awakenings over the past week, each logged as brief and resolved. Resolved by whom? Edward wondered. He checked the timestamps against staffing records. The overlaps were consistent, always during hours when supervision should have been continuous. Edward made no note yet. He stood and moved to the window, checking the seal, the curtains, the lock. All secure. The vulnerability here was not physical access. It was something else, something permitted. He returned to the chair. "You can try to sleep again. I'll be here." James turned his head slightly more this time, not fully, but enough to acknowledge him. Minutes passed. Edward remained seated, posture unchanged. He did not watch the child directly. Instead, he observed reflections in the glass cabinet, the way James's shoulders rose and fell. The room hummed softly with regulated air. Outside the door, the palace continued its routine ignorance. James did not sleep. After several minutes, the child spoke again, unprompted. "She said it was for my mother." Edward did not react outwardly. He adjusted his grip on the chair arm, a small grounding movement. "Who said that?" he asked. James swallowed, The Duchess. Edward let the title hang in the air. He did not correct it to a name. Children used titles when they were taught distance. She said if I didn't cry, she wouldn't take pictures, James added. His voice remained even, as if reciting instructions. Edward stood, slowly. He walked to the side table and picked up the folded handkerchief. He unfolded it carefully. A faint smear of moisture and something darker at the edge, not blood. Mascara, perhaps, or residue from adult makeup transferred by touch. "Did she take pictures anyway?" Edward asked. James nodded once, a single controlled movement. She said it was important. Edward refolded the handkerchief and placed it back exactly where it had been. His face remained neutral, but internally the sequence aligned with the corridor evidence. The camera disabled, the logs clean, the toy placed upright, perhaps as comfort, perhaps as staging. Edward checked the time, 04:27. Protocol dictated immediate escalation now. The involvement of a senior royal, the presence of coercion, the use of recording devices in a restricted child space, every regulation converged on a single action. Instinct urged something else: containment, preservation, protection. Edward activated the room's privacy mode, a setting intended for medical care. It limited internal access logs without alerting central command. A narrow window, temporary, justifiable. He knelt beside the bed, maintaining professional distance. "You did nothing wrong," he said. It was the only reassurance he allowed himself. James's eyes finally met his. Edward rose and moved to the door. Before opening it, he paused, listening. Footsteps approached in the corridor, measured, familiar, not a guard's pace. He recognized it from briefings and proximity. Authority was arriving. Edward placed himself between the bed and the door before it opened. His posture was unchanged, but his decision was already made. The door opened without announcement. Edward did not turn immediately. He waited for the hinge to settle, for the subtle shift in air pressure that always accompanied someone accustomed to moving through guarded spaces. Duchess Helena stood just inside the threshold. She wore a dressing robe, pale, carefully arranged, as if she had been awake but untroubled. Her hair was neat. Her expression was composed. Her eyes moved first to Edward, then to the bed. "I was told there was a disturbance," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, calibrated for late hours and thin walls. Edward inclined his head. He did not step aside. "There was an irregularity in the corridor. I'm conducting a verification." Helena's gaze flicked briefly to the monitoring tablet, now active. "You're not assigned to nursery oversight." "I am assigned to palace security," Edward said. "This falls within scope." She smiled faintly, the kind that acknowledged hierarchy without conceding ground. "James has difficulty sleeping. He always has. The staff know how to manage it." Edward did not respond. Silence again was a tool. Helena took a step forward. Edward shifted subtly, maintaining position between her and the bed. The movement was small but unmistakable. A guard's block, executed without aggression. "That won't be necessary," she said. "I can handle my nephew." Edward finally turned to face her fully. "For the moment, access is restricted." Her smile faded, replaced with something flatter. "On whose authority?" "Mine, pending clarification." The word clarification hung heavier than accusation. Helena studied him, measuring. She did not raise her voice. That would have been counterproductive. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her robe. "This is highly irregular," she said. "I'll expect a report." "You'll receive one," Edward answered. She held his gaze for a second longer, then looked past him to James. The child had gone very still. Helena's eyes softened briefly, then hardened again. She stepped back. "Very well," she said. "Don't wake him further." She left without another word. Edward waited until the sound of her footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Only then did he release the breath he had been holding. He turned back to the tablet and accessed the deeper system layers, the ones guards were discouraged from using unless necessary. He cross-referenced camera feeds with corridor access logs, then with device authorization histories. The gaps aligned too cleanly. Camera disabled for 14 minutes. No override record. No biometric confirmation. Someone had used a master credential. Edward documented everything in his personal log, attaching timestamps and system snapshots. He flagged the entry with a neutral marker, anomaly cluster pending review. He checked James again. The child's eyes were closed now, but sleep was shallow. Edward adjusted the lamp lower and moved to the door, opening it just enough to observe the corridor. The younger guard looked toward him. Edward gave a minimal nod. All clear for now. What concerned him most was not Helena's presence, but the system's silence. Protocol relied on records. Tonight, the records had been selectively erased. And erased records were not accidents. They were decisions. At 5:02, Edward accessed the internal security console in the adjacent service alcove. He logged in under his own credentials and ran a diagnostic sweep. The system responded normally, cleanly, too cleanly. He initiated a secondary query, comparing live data against archived redundancy backups. That process was slow by design, intended to discourage casual use. Edward waited, eyes on the progress bar, ears tuned to the corridor. The results populated line by line. 2 entries were missing from the redundancy archive as well. Edward leaned back slightly. Redundancy systems were isolated. Altering them required coordination and authority. This was no longer a single individual acting impulsively. It suggested institutional shielding, or at least the assumption that shielding would be provided. Edward closed the console and locked the alcove. He had enough confirmation now to escalate formally. The question was timing. If he reported immediately, the matter would be absorbed into internal review, controlled by the same hierarchy that granted master credentials. If he waited, he risked being accused of delay. Either choice carried consequence. He returned to the nursery and checked on James once more. The child's breathing had evened, but one hand remained clenched around the blanket. Edward did not touch it. He activated a passive sensor on his wrist console, linking it directly to the nursery feed, without routing through central servers. An old workaround, unofficial, rarely used. It would alert him to any movement at the door. Edward then stepped out and sealed the nursery from the outside, a measure reserved for medical isolation. It required his clearance and would generate a delayed alert at shift change, another narrow window. As dawn approached, the palace began to stir. Lights brightened incrementally. Staff moved quietly through distant corridors. The world resumed its schedule. Edward remained where he was. He knew the next phase would not be about evidence alone. It would be about interpretation, about whether concern could be reframed as misunderstanding, whether procedure could be used to blunt responsibility. He also knew that once he filed the formal report, control would shift away from him. Edward checked the time again, 5:36. He opened a new report draft, careful with language, precise with facts. He did not include conclusions. He did not include the child's words, only actions, systems, timestamps. When he saved it, he did not send it. Not yet. He stood guard as the sun began to rise, fully aware that silence now was no longer neutral.
The palace transitioned into mourning without ceremony. Edward registered the change through light first, the amber corridor panels fading into a cooler white, the artificial night giving way to institutional day. With it came movement. Staff rotations resumed. Doors that had remained sealed through the early hours opened again under ordinary authority. At 6:11, Edward received the shift change acknowledgement from Central Security. No alerts had been raised. No maintenance flags had been escalated. The system, officially, had experienced an uneventful night. Edward remained stationed near the nursery, his presence now less conspicuous amid the flow of attendants and aides. He allowed the younger guard to rotate out and replaced him with a senior corporal, citing routine coverage optimization. The explanation was accepted without comment. At 6:24, Duchess Helena exited her private wing. Edward noticed her immediately, not because she drew attention, but because she did not. Her pace was measured, her posture relaxed. She carried nothing in her hands, no phone, no tablet, no documents. That absence registered as clearly as the corridor door had hours earlier. She passed within 6 feet of Edward without acknowledging him. Edward did not follow her. He waited. At 6:31, a junior attendant entered the restricted sitting room adjacent to the nursery wing, pushing a linen cart. Edward intercepted her before she crossed the threshold. His tone was neutral, procedural. He redirected her route, citing temporary access limitations. She complied easily, apologetic, unaware of the significance. Edward entered the sitting room himself moments later. The space was understated, designed for waiting rather than occupancy. Pale furnishings, a low table, 2 chairs aligned toward a blank wall. On the table lay a mobile phone. It was placed face down, slightly off-center, as if set there quickly, not forgotten casually, but abandoned with intention. Edward did not touch it immediately. He surveyed the room first, checking corners, listening. The windows were sealed. No one else was present. He approached the table and noted the phone's case, leather, custom, embossed with a crest associated with Helena's household. There was no doubt as to ownership. Possession of a senior royal's personal device was not a matter of curiosity. It was a security risk. Edward activated his wrist console and logged the discovery as unsecured device in restricted zone. That entry would route automatically to security review, but not to household staff. He then placed the room under temporary access hold. Only then did he pick up the phone. It was warm, recently used. The screen lit when he pressed the side button. No passcode prompt appeared. The device unlocked immediately, opening to the photo gallery. Edward exhaled slowly. Protocol allowed inspection of unsecured devices found in restricted areas if there was reasonable belief of threat or compromise. Edward documented his justification before proceeding further. Every action was logged. every second time-stamped. He scrolled once. The most recent image filled the screen. Prince James. The child was seated on the nursery bed, blanket around his shoulders. His face was turned away from the camera, but his posture was unmistakable, curled inward, defensive. The timestamp read 03:58. Edward's grip tightened slightly. He did not rush. He did not skip ahead. He moved through the gallery methodically, noting sequence and timing. Every image fell within the window when the camera feed had been disabled. Then the images stopped. The next item in the gallery was a blank space, marked by a system notice. Recently deleted.
Edward accessed the deleted folder. It contained 9 images. He opened the first. James sat on the floor beside the bed, knees drawn to his chest. His hands covered his face. His shoulders were hunched, mid-motion, as if he had just been told to stay still. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing. Close. The timestamp read 03:46. Edward's gaze remained fixed. He did not allow his expression to change. The second image showed the same position seconds later. James's hands had slipped slightly. His eyes were visible now, wet, not exaggerated, not performative, the kind of crying that occurred when sound was discouraged. Edward did not look away. The remaining images followed a pattern, different angles, same subject, same hour. None showed overt physical harm. None needed to. Edward exited the gallery and checked the file metadata. The images had been deleted at 04:09, 2 minutes before Edward first observed the corridor irregularity. He returned to the gallery overview and scrolled further back. Earlier images showed routine palace documentation, events, interiors, nothing unusual. This sequence stood alone. He locked the phone and placed it on the table. He stood there for a full 30 seconds, hands at his sides, posture controlled. This was the point at which instinct pressed hardest. The evidence was clear. The involvement was unmistakable. The risk was no longer abstract. He reopened the phone and initiated a secure duplication of the deleted files to his wrist console, encrypting them under internal security protocol. He documented the transfer, noting that originals remained unaltered. Then he powered the device off. Edward did not return the phone to the table. He placed it into an evidence pouch and sealed it. Possession would be questioned. He prepared for that. At 06:92, footsteps approached the sitting room. Edward turned as Duchess Helena entered, her expression sharpening the moment she saw the sealed pouch. "That is mine," she said. "Yes," Edward replied. She looked at the pouch, then at him. "You have no authority to seize my personal property." Edward met her gaze. "Your device was found unsecured in a restricted area adjacent to the nursery. It contains material relevant to an ongoing security verification." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, in calculation. "Give it back," she said. Edward did not move. "I can't." Silence stretched between them. The palace outside the room continued its morning rhythm. "You're making a mistake," Helena said quietly. "You don't understand the context." Edward adjusted his stance, grounding himself in training. Context does not override protocol. She stepped closer. "You're a guard," she said, "not an investigator, not family." Edward's voice remained even, "And the child is under palace protection." For a moment something flickered across her face, irritation, then restraint. "This will not end the way you think," she said. Edward inclined his head slightly. "That may be so." He moved past her and exited the room, the sealed pouch secured at his side. As he walked, he knew the shift had occurred. The issue was no longer about silence or discretion. It was now about confrontation, and there would be no way to undo that.
Edward did not return directly to Central Security. That would have been the obvious move, and obvious moves traveled fastest through institutional channels. Instead, he took the longer internal route, passing through service corridors designed to keep staff circulation discreet and segmented. The evidence pouch remained secured at his side, its weight unchanged, but its significance expanding with every step. He entered the secondary security office at 7-8. It was a functional room, windowless, used primarily for documentation overflow and incident review preparation. No senior officers occupied it at this hour. That, too, was intentional. Edward logged the seizure formally. He documented the location, time, condition of the device, and the justification for accessing and duplicating its contents. He used measured language, avoiding implication. The system accepted the report and assigned it a reference number. That number mattered. It meant the material now existed within Palace records, even if only marginally. He connected his wrist console to the secure terminal and verified the encrypted copies. The images appeared exactly as before. No corruption, no alteration. He cross-checked metadata again. Timestamps aligned with the disabled camera window. Device ID matched the seized phone. Edward added a single annotation. Images depict a protected minor in visible emotional distress within restricted space during hours logged as undisturbed. Nothing more. At 7:44, a request pinged his console. Senior Security Liaison requesting status update. Edward did not respond immediately. He completed the evidence chain entry first, then sealed the digital file under restricted access, viewable only by command-level authorization. Only then did he acknowledge the request. He was instructed to report to the internal review chamber at 8 o'clock. Edward left the office and returned briefly to the nursery wing. He did not enter the room. Instead, he checked the access log. No entry since his departure. The privacy mode remained active. James was still asleep. Edward adjusted the guard rotation again, placing 2 experienced officers on opposite ends of the corridor. He offered no explanation beyond heightened observation. Neither questioned it. As he stepped away, he became aware of eyes on him. Not openly, side glances, subtle shifts in posture as staff passed. Information moved quickly in closed environments. The fact of the phone seizure was already circulating, stripped of detail, inflated by proximity to power. At 7:44, Edward encountered Captain Rowley outside the review chamber. The captain's expression was neutral, but his tone was not unkind. "You've created momentum," Rowley said quietly as they walked. Edward nodded once. "I recorded what occurred." Rowley studied him for a moment. "You're aware of the sensitivity." "I am," Edward replied. The captain did not argue. He did not agree either. The internal review chamber was designed to feel impartial. Neutral colors, no insignia. A long table with evenly spaced chairs. Edward stood at attention near the wall as 3 officials entered, the security liaison, a legal advisor, and a senior household representative. None wore robes. Authority here was understated. Edward was instructed to sit.
The liaison began by summarizing the incident in procedural terms: an unsecured device, restricted area, evidence seizure. He spoke as if reading weather data. When Edward was asked to present his findings, he did so without embellishment. He referenced timestamps, access credentials, system gaps. He did not describe the images in emotional terms. He did not mention James's words. The legal advisor requested to view the duplicated files. Edward authorized access. The room grew quieter as the images appeared on the shared screen. No one commented immediately. The household representative shifted slightly in his chair. The liaison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "These images," the advisor said carefully, "do not show physical harm. No, they show a protected minor in distress during an unlogged access window." Silence followed. The household representative spoke next. "The Duchess has stated the images were taken with benign intent, documentation, personal reassurance." Edward did not react. "The deletion," the representative continued, "suggests regret, not malice." Edward kept his eyes forward. "The deletion coincides with the restoration of camera feeds." That detail landed. The liaison raised his hand slightly. "Captain Rowley, you'll ensure the nursery remains under enhanced observation, quietly." Rowley nodded. The advisor closed the file viewer. "This matter will be reframed as a procedural irregularity pending further clarification." Edward understood the phrasing. Reframed meant softened. Pending meant delayed. "And the device?" Edward asked. The liaison hesitated. "It will be returned after review." Edward nodded once. He had expected that. "You are to submit no further independent actions without authorization," the liaison added. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Edward said. The meeting concluded without formal reprimand. That absence was not reassuring. As Edward stood to leave, the household representative addressed him directly for the first time. "Your diligence is noted," he said, "but context matters here." Edward met his gaze briefly. "So does protection." He exited the chamber knowing he had reached the limit of what evidence alone could accomplish. As he returned to his post, his console vibrated softly, a motion alert from the nursery feed. Someone had approached the door. Edward quickened his pace, already aware that whatever happened next would no longer be contained within reports or review rooms. The situation was escalating, and this time it would not be quiet. The meeting was scheduled for 8:17 and began at 8:16. Edward noted the timing automatically. Authority rarely arrived late when it intended to assert itself. The room was smaller than the review chamber, positioned deeper within the administrative wing, away from public corridors. No windows, no insignia. A table polished to the point of reflection. 3 chairs on one side, 1 on the other. Edward stood until instructed to sit. Duchess Helena entered last. She did not look at him immediately. She took her seat with deliberate calm, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket as if the morning required composure rather than urgency. 2 officials were already present, the senior security liaison and a representative from household affairs. Both acknowledged Edward with brief nods that conveyed familiarity without support. "This is not a disciplinary hearing," the liaison began. His voice was even. "It's a clarification." Edward remained silent. Helena folded her hands on the table. "I want this resolved," she said, quietly. Edward's gaze stayed level. He had learned that quiet was often the most loaded word in the palace vocabulary. The household representative spoke next. "Your actions last night and this morning exceeded customary discretion."
They followed protocol, Edward replied. Helena's eyes flicked toward him. Protocol is not a weapon, it's a structure. Edward inclined his head slightly. Structures exist to protect. The liaison raised a hand, gentle but firm. No one is disputing intent. The concern is proportionality. Edward considered his response carefully. The child was recorded in distress during a period logged as undisturbed. The recording device belonged to a senior household member. The system logs were altered. Helena leaned back in her chair. You're repeating yourself. I'm clarifying, Edward said. Her expression tightened. You are implying misconduct. I am documenting risk. The household representative interjected. Risk assessment must account for context, family dynamics, emotional nuance. Edward did not look at him. Context does not negate safeguards. A pause followed, not uncomfortable, calculated. Helena leaned forward. You've served here a long time, she said. You understand how fragile trust is in this institution. Edward met her gaze. Yes. And you understand, she continued, that overreach damages that trust. Edward did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was controlled. So does silence. The liaison exhaled softly. This situation will be handled internally. The device will be returned. The review will proceed. Your involvement will end here. Edward understood the phrasing. End here meant withdrawal without concession. I'm being instructed to disengage, he asked. Yes, the liaison said. Edward nodded once. Then I'll need that instruction in writing. The household representative frowned slightly. Helena did not. Of course, she said, transparency matters. Edward stood as the meeting concluded. Helena arose as well. For a moment, they faced each other across the polished surface. You believe you're protecting him, she said quietly. Edward did not respond. You're mistaken, Helena added. Edward inclined his head, neither agreeing nor denying. He left the room without looking back.
The security details arrived 23 minutes later. Edward read them carefully at his post, eyes scanning each line. Temporary disengagement from nursery oversight. No further independent action. Await reassignment pending review. The language was precise, the tone neutral, the authority absolute. He acknowledged receipt. Within the hour, subtle changes followed. His access to certain feeds was downgraded. His patrol route adjusted, not removed, redirected. Each change was small enough to appear administrative. Together, they formed a boundary. Edward adapted without comment. He continued observing, just from further away. At 9:42, he saw Helena cross the east gallery with 2 aides. Her pace was unhurried. She spoke softly, smiling once. Nothing in her demeanor suggested concern. That, too, was a signal. Edward checked the nursery access log. An override had been pre-authorized for the morning. The justification field read Household Continuity. He recorded it. At 1:03, Captain Raleigh approached him near the service stairwell. They're closing this down, he said quietly. Edward nodded. You pushed them, Raleigh continued. They're pushing back. Edward kept his eyes forward. That was expected. Raleigh hesitated. You could still step away cleanly. Edward looked at him then. And leave the system unchanged? Raleigh did not answer. The next directive came shortly after. Edward was reassigned 2 corridors away. his presence no longer intersecting directly with the nursery wing. The order was politely, almost apologetically. Reassignment acknowledged compliance without endorsing judgment. Edward adjusted his position and resumed duty. From his new vantage point, he saw James leave the education wing later that morning. The child walked with his tutor, posture rigid, eyes forward. Helena was not present. That absence was noted in the system as routine. Edward watched until the corridor swallowed them. He understood now that authority had drawn its line, not with force, but with structure, not with denial, but with absorption. The incident would be reframed, the evidence archived, the risk renamed. What remained was choice. Edward updated his personal log one final time that morning. He did not add interpretation, only sequence. Meetings, instructions, overrides. Each entry time-stamped, each preserved. As he closed the log, he knew the next step would not be sanctioned. It would not be quiet, and it would not be reversible. Authority had spoken. Edward had heard it clearly, and he was no longer willing to pretend that listening was the same as obeying. Edward reached the nursery corridor as the alert cleared. The door had been opened and closed within 5 seconds, long enough to enter, long enough to be seen, not long enough to linger. 2 senior attendants stood near the junction, their posture carefully neutral. One held a clipboard, the other avoided looking at him. Edward acknowledged them with a nod and continued forward. The privacy seal on the nursery door was no longer active. Inside, the lighting had been raised to morning level. James was sitting up in bed, dressed now in day clothes laid out by staff. A physician stood nearby, checking vitals with practiced efficiency. Duchess Helena stood at the window, back straight, hands folded. She did not turn when Edward entered. The physician finished and stepped aside. "The child is fit for routine activities," he said, as if reading from a standard line. He glanced briefly at Edward, then at Helena, and left. Edward positioned himself near the door. He did not approach the bed. His role here was no longer ambiguous. Helena turned at last. "You see," she said calmly, "all is well." Edward did not respond. "The household has decided that James will attend breakfast as usual. There is no need for further disruption." Edward's gaze moved to James. The child's shoulders were tense. His hands were folded too neatly in his lap, his fingers interlocked. He did not look up. "There is a standing security hold," Edward said. "It has not been formally lifted." Helena smiled faintly. "It has been overridden." Edward inclined his head slightly. "By whom?" "By those empowered to do so," she replied. Edward did not block the doorway. That would have been an overt act. Instead, he raised his wrist and keyed a quiet query to Central Security. "Override confirmation." The response came back quickly. "Authorized." The structure was closing ranks. Edward stepped aside. Helena moved toward the bed and placed a hand lightly on James's shoulder. The touch was brief, controlled, visible. James flinched almost imperceptibly. He logged it. They exited together minutes later, James flanked by attendants. Edward followed at regulation distance, his presence now symbolic rather than controlling. Staff watched as they passed. No one spoke. At breakfast, the palace appeared unchanged. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Silverware clinked softly. Conversation remained polite, restrained. James sat at the long table, small among adults, his posture rigid. Edward took position along the perimeter. He watched reflections in glass, movements behind shoulders. Helena spoke occasionally, her tone even. She did not look at Edward again. Halfway through the meal, a senior official approached Edward quietly. "You are relieved from nursery oversight, temporary reassignment." Edward acknowledged the order without comment. Reassignment was not punishment. It was displacement.
Edward's new post placed him 2 corridors away, close enough to observe movement patterns, but too far to intervene quickly. The message was clear: remain present but peripheral. From his position, he saw James leave the dining area with his tutor shortly after breakfast. Helena did not accompany them. That too was noted. Edward requested a status update on the evidence review. The response was delayed. When it arrived, it was brief. Matter under consideration. No further action at this time. By mid-morning, the narrative had begun to settle. Staff spoke of a misunderstanding, of overcaution, of a guard acting with excessive zeal. The language was subtle but consistent. Edward did not correct it. At 1:17, Captain Rowley approached him again. "You're being discussed," he said quietly. Edward nodded. "They're framing this as a welfare disagreement," Rowley continued, "not a security breach." Edward kept his eyes forward. "And the child?" Rowley hesitated. "Is considered stable." Edward absorbed that. Stable was not safe. It was convenient. At 03, Edward received a formal notice. The seized device would be returned to its owner. The duplicated files would remain archived under restricted access, pending no further developments. Edward read the notice twice, then once more. He requested permission to submit a supplementary report. Rowley looked at him. "That won't be welcomed." Edward understood. Supplementary meant persistence. It meant refusing the offered exit. "I'll submit it anyway," Edward said. Rowley exhaled slowly. "Be precise." Edward spent the next hour drafting. He did not repeat earlier findings. He added only new observations: the child's flinch, the override timing, the coordinated language shift. Each detail stood on its own. When he submitted it, the system accepted it without comment. At 12:42, a new directive appeared on his console. "Stand down from direct involvement. Await further instruction." Edward closed the notice. He remained where he was. From across the courtyard, he saw James at a window in the education wing. The child's face was partially obscured by glass, but his posture was familiar now, inward, guarded. Edward adjusted his stance, eyes tracking the corridor entrances, already aware that escalation rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived through quiet exclusion, through authority exercised cleanly and without record. And Edward understood that if protection was going to occur now, it would not come from permission. It would come from decision. The directive to stand down remained active through the early afternoon. Edward did not challenge it. He had learned that resistance was most effective when delayed, when framed as compliance until the precise moment it no longer could be. From his reassigned post, he observed routine continue. Tutors moved between wings. Staff rotated in predictable intervals. The palace settled into its midday rhythm, confident that the disruption had been contained. At 13:18, Edward noticed a deviation.
James did not attend his scheduled language session. The tutor waited in the corridor for several minutes before leaving, confusion masked as patience. No explanation was logged, no replacement activity was recorded. Edward checked the internal movement board. James's location was listed as with household. That designation was intentionally vague, used when privacy was prioritized over specificity. Edward requested clarification through official channels. The response came back within minutes. Household discretion, no security concern. Edward closed the message. He began assembling a parallel record, nothing overt. He noted timing discrepancies, unexplained absences, the clustering of authority overrides around a single individual. Each entry was factual, each stood independently. Together, they formed a trajectory. At 14:02, a maintenance request appeared in the system for the nursery wing, electrical diagnostics, non-urgent, scheduled for the following morning. Edward recognized the pattern immediately. Maintenance requests were often used to justify access resets, data scrubbing, quiet reconfiguration. The last opportunity to preserve the environment as it had been was closing. He made his decision then. Edward contacted Captain Rowley directly, bypassing intermediaries. He requested a private meeting under operational review grounds. Rowley agreed, though his hesitation was audible even through the secure channel. They met in a small briefing room overlooking the inner courtyard. No recording devices were active. That detail mattered. "I'm invoking custodial protection," Edward said. Rowley stared at him. "You don't have unilateral authority for that." "I do under Section 9, immediate risk to a protected minor where institutional delay compromises welfare." Rowley leaned back, rubbing his temple. "That clause is meant for external threats. It doesn't specify origin, only risk." Silence stretched. "If you proceed," said Rowley carefully, "this will be seen as insubordination." Edward nodded. "I'm aware." "And you'll force a response." "Yes." Rowley looked out the window. James was not visible from this angle. "Once you do this," he said, "there's no quiet resolution." Edward stood. "There already isn't." The transfer was executed at 14:41. Edward coordinated it through medical protocol, not security. A routine wellness evaluation. Transport authorized by the palace physician under discretionary care provisions. No alarms, no announcements. James was escorted from the education wing by 2 guards Edward trusted implicitly. Their expressions were neutral, their movements unhurried. To any observer, it appeared ordinary. Edward met them at the medical annex. James walked beside the guards, shoulders tight, eyes lowered. When he saw Edward, he stopped, not abruptly, just enough to signal recognition. "You're going somewhere quiet for a while," he said. "The doctors want to check your sleep." James searched his face, as if looking for something specific. Edward gave nothing away. Calm was the point. "Will she be there?" James asked. "No," Edward replied. That was all. The medical team took over, efficient and discreet. James was led down the corridor and out of sight. Edward remained until the doors closed. The response was swift. At 15:12, Edward was summoned to Central Command. This time the atmosphere was different. No neutrality, no procedural calm. Authority was present, and it was displeased. "You exceeded your mandate,"
the liaison said. "You forced a custodial separation without consensus. I acted within protocol. You acted against instruction. I acted for protection." The distinction was not persuasive to them. Edward was relieved of duty pending review. His clearance was reduced, his access restricted. He surrendered his wrist console without comment. As he was escorted out of command, he passed Duchess Helena in the corridor. She did not stop, neither did he. That evening, the palace released a statement, a brief note about a child undergoing routine evaluation. No mention of cause, no mention of conflict. Edward left the palace grounds just before dusk. He paused once at the gate, looking back at the stone facade, unchanged and imposing. He did not know how the review would conclude. He did not know whether the evidence would resurface or be buried permanently. What he did know was this: James was somewhere quiet, somewhere watched, somewhere without cameras turned off or doors left ajar. Edward adjusted his coat and stepped into the street. For the first time since 4/12, the silence felt earned.